The paper shook in Theodora Garrison's hands, not because of the desert wind that swept through the cracked window of her one-room dwelling on the edge of Caldwell, Kansas, but because of what was written on it. Both sides. She had only meant to read one. She had only meant to read the letter, the careful, earnest, terrifying letter that Edwin Warren had pressed into her palm 3 days ago without a single word of explanation, his jaw tight and his gray eyes somewhere between desperate and resigned, like a man who had already made peace with rejection and was only going through the motions of hope. She had tucked the folded paper into the pocket of her apron and forgotten about it in the chaos of that afternoon. Mrs. Hollis had needed help with her twin boys. The water barrel had needed filling. The bread had burned. Life on the frontier had a way of swallowing private moments whole. But tonight, when the boys were asleep and the prairie had gone quiet and the oil lamp threw its amber circle across the table, Theodora had finally pulled the paper out and unfolded it. She read the letter first, the side Edwin had clearly intended her to read, and she had pressed her hand over her mouth halfway through because the words were so unexpectedly raw and honest and unguarded that they felt almost violent in how deeply they landed. And then she had turned the paper over, not out of nosiness, not out of some calculating impulse, but simply because the lamplight had shone through and she had seen ink on the other side, and curiosity in a woman like Theodora Garrison was not something that could be reasoned away. The other side was a land deed, not just any land deed, the deed to the Garrison parcel, her parcel. 160 acres of Kansas grassland that bore her family name, and that she had been fighting in the Comanche County land office for 6 months to hold on to since her father's death. The same land that Aldous Crew and his associates had been systematically pressuring her to relinquish. The same land that no attorney in 3 towns would touch because Aldous Crew owned most of them through debt or fear. The deed on the back of Edwin's letter bore his name, Edwin Warren, claimant of record. Theodora set the paper down on the table very slowly, the way a person sets down something they are afraid of. Then she picked it up again. Then she set it down. The lamp flickered. Outside, a coyote answered another coyote somewhere far across the flats, the sound lonely and certain at once. She read the letter again. Then she read the deed again. Then, in the silence of that small room with the prairie breathing its dark breath against the walls, Theodora Garrison said yes to each. She did not know yet what either yes would cost her. She did not know yet what it would save. To understand how a woman like Theodora arrived at a moment like that, you have to go back 6 months, to the October afternoon when the telegram arrived from Dodge City telling her that her father, Robert Garrison, had died of a heart seizure while arguing with a land speculator in the street outside the First National Bank, and that she should come at once to settle his affairs. Robert Garrison had been a stubborn man, a Kansas homesteader of the old school, the kind of man who believed that land was not property so much as covenant. He had come out to Comanche County in 1873, 4 years after the Homestead Act had opened the territory, and he had filed his claim and built his house and broken his back across those 160 acres, with the quiet ferocity of someone who understood that the land did not owe him anything, and that everything he got from it he would have to earn by sheer persistence. He had raised Theodora alone after her mother died of typhoid in 1878, when Theodora was 9 years old. He had raised her to be capable. He had raised her to read legal documents and balance ledgers, and shoe a horse and bake bread and argue with a clear head, because he understood, perhaps better than most men of his time, that a woman alone on the frontier was either equipped or she was lost. He had made sure his daughter would not be lost. What Robert Garrison had not managed to do in all his preparation was protect the deed itself. Theodora arrived in Caldwell on the 5th of November, 1884, on the afternoon stage from Dodge City. She was 27 years old, dark-haired, with her mother's sharp green eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. She wore a gray wool traveling dress that had been mended at the left sleeve and boots that needed new soles, and she carried one carpetbag and her father's old leather satchel, which contained everything she had managed to gather before leaving the boarding house where she had been working as a bookkeeper for the past 2 years. The land office was her first stop. She did not even go to the hotel first. She walked directly from the stage depot down Front Street through the November cold, her heels loud on the boardwalk, and pushed open the door of the Comanche County land office without knocking. The clerk behind the counter was a thin young man named Petty who looked at her with the particular combination of sympathy and nervousness that men tended to adopt when they had bad news and no clear obligation to deliver it. "Miss Garrison," he said, "I've been expecting you." "The deed," she said. "I need to see the deed for the Garrison parcel, 160 on the South Fork draw." Petty cleared his throat. He opened a drawer. He closed it again. He opened a different drawer. "Miss Garrison," he said, and then stopped. "Mr. Petty, there's a complication." The complication, as Petty eventually and sweating explained it, was that 6 weeks before Robert Garrison's death, the deed to the Garrison parcel had been presented to the land office for amendment. The amendment had attached a lien. The lien had been registered in the name of Aldous Crew, owner of the Crew Land and Cattle Company, against a debt that Robert Garrison had allegedly contracted for $300 borrowed the previous spring. Theodora looked at the amended document. She read every word. Then she looked at her father's signature on the debt instrument. "This signature is wrong," she said. Petty said nothing. "My father always wrote his capital R with 2 loops. This has 1. His G was open at the bottom. This one is closed." She set the paper down. "Someone forged this, Mr. Petty." Petty looked at the document and then at the wall behind her left shoulder. "I wouldn't be able to speak to that, Miss Garrison." "No," she said. "I don't imagine you would." She walked out of the land office and stood on the boardwalk in the cold November air and breathed through the fury that was rising in her chest like floodwater, systematic and unstoppable. Aldous Crew. She had heard the name before. Her father had mentioned him in letters, cautiously at first, then with increasing wariness. Crew had come into Comanche County 2 years back with Eastern money and a smooth manner, and had begun buying up parcels on every side of the established homesteads, slowly surrounding the original settlers the way water surrounds islands, patient and inexorable. He had a particular interest in the South Fork draw because the spring there ran year-round, the only reliable water source for 5 miles in any direction. Whoever held that spring controlled the grazing for half the county. Her father had refused to sell. And now her father was dead, and the deed was compromised, and she was standing alone on a boardwalk in Caldwell, Kansas in November with 1 carpetbag and a satchel full of ledgers and no attorney willing to take her case. The hotel where Theodora took a room that first night was called the Drover's Rest, a 2-story wooden building on the east end of Front Street that smelled of tobacco and boiled beef, and the particular kind of human despair that accumulates in places where people are between things. The proprietor was a widow named Agnes Hollies, a broad-shouldered woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair, and the no-nonsense competence of someone who had survived considerable difficulty through the application of pure practicality. Agnes took one look at Theodora standing in her lobby with her mended sleeve and her satchel and her expression of barely controlled fury, and said without preamble, "You're Robert Garrison's daughter." "I am," Theodora said. "Your room is at the top of the stairs, second on the left. Supper is at 6. The bath is on Thursday. I'll put a water pitcher in your room tonight and you can wash the road off." Agnes paused, studying her. "I knew your father. He was a decent man. What Crew did to that deed is the most dishonest thing I have seen in 12 years running this establishment, and I have seen considerable dishonesty." Theodora felt something in her chest loosen slightly, not much, but enough. "You know about the forgery. Half the county knows about the forgery. Knowing and doing anything about it are 2 different animals entirely." Agnes looked at her steadily. "You'll want to talk to Edwin Warren." The name meant nothing to Theodora then. It was just a name on a list she did not yet have. "Who is Edwin Warren?" Surveyor, has an office on the south end of Front Street past the feed store. He's been in the county 4 years. Quiet man. Reliable. He surveyed your father's parcel twice, once when your father first filed and once 2 years ago when crews started buying up the surrounding land, and your father wanted an independent record of the boundaries. Agnes wiped down the counter with a cloth that had seen better years. He kept a copy of the survey in his own records. He's the only man in this town who has documentation that predates Crew's interference. Has he been willing to bring it forward? Agnes was quiet for a moment in a way that said more than words. Edwin Warren has his own reasons for keeping his head down, but he's an honest man. I'll say that for him. Theodora went to her room and sat on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about honest men who kept their heads down, and whether honesty that stayed quiet was worth anything at all. She found Edwin Warren the next morning at 9 o'clock, when the frost was still hard on the ground, and the smoke from every chimney on Front Street was going straight up in the still cold air. His office was indeed past the feed store, a low building of unpainted cedar with a hand-lettered sign that read Warren's Survey and Land Assessment. She did not knock. She opened the door and went in. He was at a drafting table with his back to her, bent over a large paper pinned flat at the corners. He was taller than she had expected, broad through the shoulders but lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of hands that belonged to someone who worked both indoors and out. He wore a plain gray shirt and dark trousers and suspenders, and he was drawing with the slow, precise care of a man who understood that accuracy in his work was not optional. "Mr. Warren," she said. He turned. She had the brief, sharp impression of a face that was angular and weathered and serious, with gray eyes that took her in with the kind of direct, assessing attention that was not rude, but was absolutely not deferential either. He was perhaps 30, perhaps 32. There was something in his expression that was guarded in the specific way of someone who had learned to be careful, not frightened, but careful. "Miss Garrison," he said. His voice was low and even. She had not told him her name. "You know who I am. Agnes Holly sent a boy over 20 minutes ago to say you'd likely be coming. Please sit down." He gestured to the straight-backed chair beside his drafting table. "I've been expecting this conversation since I heard about your father." Theodora sat. She folded her hands in her lap with the deliberate calm of someone managing a great deal of internal pressure. "Then you know about the deed." "I know about the Leon crew attached." He turned fully from the table to face her. "And I know what Petty told you, and I know that the signature on that debt instrument is not your father's signature." "You're certain?" "I witnessed your father sign 3 separate documents over the 4 years I've been surveying in this county. I know his signature. That document is a forgery." He said it plainly, without heat, as if he were stating a measurement. "The question is what to do about it." "The question," Theodora said, "is why you haven't done anything about it yet." The silence that followed was several seconds long. Edwin Warren looked at her with an expression that was not defensive and not ashamed, but was complicated in a way she could not immediately read, like a document in a language she mostly knew. "That's a fair question," he said finally, "and you deserve an honest answer. But the answer is not simple, and it is not one I'm prepared to give in full this morning." He held her gaze. "What I can tell you is that I have not been idle, and I have not been complicit. I have been trying to build a foundation that will not collapse the moment we use it." "Build it faster," Theodora said. He looked at her for another moment with that measuring, careful expression. Then very slightly, almost invisibly, something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but something in the neighborhood of one. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She went back to the Drover's Rest and helped Agnes Holly's with breakfast for the boarders, because she could not afford to pay for her room in money, and because doing something useful with her hands was the only thing that kept the anxiety from becoming overwhelming. She washed dishes and set tables and listened to Agnes talk about the county, about Crew's methods, about the homesteaders who had already sold and the few who had not. "There are 4 families left on the South Fork draw," Agnes said. scrubbing a pot with focused energy. "Your father's land and the Weaver family and the old Dutchman Braun and the Kellerman widow. Crew has offered each of them money twice. Each has refused. Now he's got more creative." "More creative how?" "Weaver had his fence cut 3 times last summer. Braun had a portion of his water redirected. Kellerman widow had a man show up telling her the title to her parcel had a defect from the original filing back in '74 and offering to buy her out for a fraction of what it's worth." Agnes set down the pot and looked at Theodora directly. "They're scared, Miss Garrison. All of them. Crew has 2 deputies in his pocket and enough money to tie anything up in court for years. And he knows that most of these families don't have years." "Who is Crew working with in the land office?" Theodora asked. Agnes looked at her steadily. "That is a question you want to be careful asking out loud." "I am always careful," Theodora said. "I am simply also persistent." Over the next week, Theodora established herself in Caldwell with the quiet, methodical determination of someone who understood that the battle she was fighting was going to be won or lost on paperwork and patience, rather than confrontation. She visited each of the remaining South Fork homesteaders. She sat in their kitchens and looked at their original filings and listened to their accounts of Crew's escalating pressure. She compiled everything into the ledger system her father had taught her, methodical and cross-referenced, building a record. She visited the land office daily, asking questions that Petty answered with increasing nervousness. She visited the county recorder's office and found, after 3 separate visits in which she asked to see different categories of documents for reasons she made sound administrative rather than investigative, a pattern in the original filing dates that did not quite line up with the recorded amendments. And every 2 or 3 days, she found herself back in Edwin Warren's office. He was always there when she arrived. After the first few visits, she stopped being surprised by this and started to wonder if he noticed her pattern of appearing and to wonder, with a small and private and somewhat alarming honesty, whether he minded. He did not appear to mind. What became clear over those early weeks was that Edwin Warren was not, as she had initially suspected, a man hiding comfortable complicity behind a veneer of frustrated virtue. He was something more complicated and more sympathetic. A man who had arrived in Comanche County 4 years ago carrying his own hidden weight and had found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he cared about the place and the people in it, and that caring had put him in a position of profound and uncomfortable conflict. The weight, as she slowly pieced it together from fragments he offered in the careful, measured way of someone who had learned to give information slowly and assess the reaction before giving more, was this. Edwin Warren had come to Comanche County, originally in the employ of a land survey company out of Topeka that had, as he had gradually and horrifyingly discovered, been receiving fees from Aldous Crew's interests to ensure that certain boundary surveys contained small, plausible errors that would later be exploited to challenge titles. He had not known this when he took the job. He had known it within 6 months. He had refused to falsify the Garrison survey. He had been told, with specific and credible menace, that if he brought what he knew to the county authorities, certain information about his previous employment in Missouri, information that was technically accurate but strategically framed, would be released in a way that would make him appear to be the architect of the fraud rather than its resistor. He had quit the survey company. He had set up independently. He had kept his records, including the clean Garrison survey, locked in a trunk under his floorboards, against the day when he could use them in a way that would stick. What he had not calculated, he told her one gray December afternoon while she sat across from his drafting table, and the wind pressed against the cedar walls of his office with a sound like breathing, was that the legal strategy he was building would require more time than Robert Garrison had. "Your father knew he was running out of time," Edwin said. He was not looking at her when he said it. He was looking at the survey spread across the table between them. "He came to me 2 months before he died. He was worried about you." He said his daughter was in Dodge City and that she was capable and strong, but that he was afraid she would come back to a situation so tangled that even her capability would not be enough. Theodora was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth, that I was close to having what we needed, but that close was not done." He paused. He said, "Tell her about the spring. If anything happens to me before this is resolved, tell my daughter about the spring." "The spring," Theodora said. "What about it?" Edwin looked at her then. "The South Fork Spring does not originate on the Garrison parcel. Everyone assumes it does because that's where it surfaces. But the water table that feeds it runs under the county line, which means the spring itself has a secondary legal status under the Territorial Water Rights Statutes of 1875 that Crew's team either doesn't know about or is choosing to ignore. If we can establish the hydrological source in a formal survey and have it registered with the Territorial Water Commission in Wichita, it creates a protected status for the spring that Crew cannot buy his way around through the county land office." Theodora stared at him. "You can do that survey." "I have been doing it," he said, "for the past 18 months, taking measurements, logging water levels, documenting the subsurface pattern. I have enough data to make the case. What I need is a Territorial Water Commissioner to receive it officially." He looked at her with that careful gray gaze. "What I have been unable to obtain, because Crew has ears in Wichita as well as in Caldwell, is a safe channel for getting that documentation to the right hands without Crew intercepting it first." Theodora thought about this for a moment. "My father used to say that the law is only as useful as the person holding it." Your father was right. "I know a man in Wichita," she said slowly, thinking through it. "A railroad attorney named Marsh who handled a contract dispute I assisted with from the Dodge City Ledger office. He has no connection to Crew's interests. He has a colleague who works adjacent to the Territorial Commission." Edwin was very still. "That could be a door." "It could be. Or it could be a trap if Marsh has been approached by Crew's people since I last dealt with him." She met his gaze squarely. "I would need to go to Wichita in person. I would need to take copies of the relevant documents. And I would need to do it quietly enough that Crew's network didn't know I was going until it was too late to matter." The silence between them had a quality that was different from the silences that had preceded it. Something had shifted. Some threshold had been crossed from the careful, professional exchange of information into something that was more like partnership, like the kind of trust that is built between people who are relying on each other for something that genuinely matters. "Miss Garrison," Edwin said, "I want to be direct with you about something. Please. The risk here is not abstract. Crew is not a man who will accept defeat through legal means gracefully. If we make this move and it succeeds, it will expose not only the fraudulent lien, but potentially the whole pattern of land manipulation he's been running in this county. That will make him dangerous in a way he has not been yet. Not merely aggressive, dangerous." Theodora looked at him for a long, level moment. "Are you advising me not to proceed?" "I'm advising you to understand what you're walking into." "I understand exactly what I'm walking into," she said. "I walked into it the day I stepped off the stage in November. The only question is whether I walk through it alone or with someone beside me." The silence after that was the longest yet and the most loaded, and neither of them looked away. "Not alone," Edwin said. "Not if you'll have the company." They began to work in earnest after that, and the working was its own kind of intimacy, the daily proximity of a shared and difficult purpose. The late afternoons in his office when the lamp was lit and the wind was up, and the papers were spread between them, and they talked through every angle and contingency with the focused seriousness of people who had too much to lose to be sloppy about anything. Theodora learned in those weeks the specific texture of Edwin Warren's mind, the way he thought in systems and patterns, the way he never made an assertion he couldn't support, the way he listened with his whole attention and did not speak until he had something worth saying. She learned that he had grown up in St. Louis, the son of a civil engineer who had taught him drafting and surveying as soon as he was old enough to hold a pencil straight. She learned that he had come west not for adventure or for land, but because the measuring of the land had always felt to him like a way of understanding it honestly, of giving it the respect of accurate knowledge. She learned that he was funny, in the quiet, dry way of people who are funny without trying to be, and that he was not naturally quiet so much as naturally selective about what he said, which was different. He learned, in turn, the specific texture of Theodora Garrison. He learned that she had been keeping ledgers since she was 12 years old, and that she had the kind of mind that remembered numbers and sequences with the precision of someone who had trained herself to notice what others overlooked. He learned that she had refused 2 previous offers of marriage in Dodge City, not because the men were bad men, but because she had seen, in both cases, that what was being offered was a cage dressed up as a home, and that she had not come this far on her own resources to trade them in for someone else's management of her life. He learned that she loved the Kansas grass, not despite its severity, but because of it, the same way she seemed to love everything that was honest about difficulty and earned about beauty. December became January. The cold on the flats was absolute and silent, the kind of cold that made every sound carry and every breath visible, and every decision feel weighted with consequence. They sent the first communication to Wichita in the second week of January, a carefully worded letter to Marcus Marsh that said less than it meant, and enough that a careful reader would understand the nature of the request. They sent it with a circuit rider named Dobbins who owed Agnes Hollies a favor and who had no connection to anyone in Crew's network. Marsh wrote back in 10 days. He had a colleague. The colleague was willing to receive a documentation package. The channel was, as far as Marsh could determine, clean. Theodora booked the stage to Wichita for the 3rd week of January. She told Agnes she was going to look into a family matter. She told no one else. The night before she left, she stopped by Edwin's office at dusk. She told herself she was going over the documentation one final time to make sure everything was in order. This was true. It was not the whole truth. He had the oil lamp burning bright and the papers organized into the exact sequence they had planned. And when she came in, he poured them each a cup of coffee from the pot on his small iron stove, and they stood on opposite sides of the drafting table and went through every document one more time, her checking against her notes, him confirming against his records. When they were done, the stack of papers was ready in the leather satchel that had been her father's, and the lamp was burning low and the coffee was cold, and neither of them moved toward the door. "Be careful in Wichita," Edwin said. "I will. Marsh is trustworthy as far as we know. But be careful of what you say beyond what the documents already say." "I know." She looked at him across the table. "Edwin." It was the first time she had used his given name. She had been aware of not using it, in the way you are aware of not stepping over a particular line, and now she had stepped over it and the difference in the air was immediate and specific. He looked at her. "If this goes wrong," she said, "not the trip, I mean the whole of it, if we do everything right and it still doesn't hold, I want you to know that none of that is on you. You kept my father's survey clean when you didn't have to. You've given 4 months to this when you had no obligation. That is not nothing." He was quiet for a moment. In the low lamplight his face had lost some of its daytime guardedness, and she could see more clearly than usual what was underneath it, something serious and tender and held very carefully in check. "Your father kept his faith in this land for 20 years against everything that was stacked against him," Edwin said. "You came back here when you could have walked away and called it a loss. That is not nothing either." They looked at each other for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "I'll see you when I return," Theodora said. "Yes," he said, "you will." The Wichita trip was 4 days, and they were 4 of the most carefully orchestrated days of Theodora Garrison's life. She met with Marcus Marsh on the afternoon of her arrival, in his law office on Market Street, and spent 2 hours going through the documentation with him in the precise and systematic way Edwin had helped her prepare for. Marsh was a compact, silver-haired man of about 55 who had the lawyer's habit of reading everything twice before responding, and who, to his considerable credit, read the Garrison file with the expression of someone who was both impressed and quietly outraged. "This is a thorough piece of fraud," he said, setting down the debt instrument with its forged signature. "And this water rights documentation is remarkable work. How long did Warren spend on this?" 18 months of field measurement, Theodora said, plus the original survey. His methodology is unimpeachable. Marsh tapped the hydrological survey with one finger. "If we get this in front of Commissioner Hale in the right way, with the right framing, it creates a protected status that supersedes the county-level lien process entirely. Crew would have to fight it at the territorial level, which is a different arena with different rules and different judges." "Can you get it to Commissioner Hale?" "I can get it to his deputy, Wallace, who is a careful man and an honest one. The timing matters. Hale will be in Wichita next week for the winter commission session. If Wallace has this before the session opens, it can be entered into the session record, which gives it a formal status that makes it much harder to quietly suppress afterward. Then we have until the session opens." "We have 5 days," Marsh said. "I'll need one to prepare the formal submission." "That leaves 4 days for anything that might go sideways." Nothing went sideways, which in itself was a kind of miracle, or perhaps it was preparation mistaken for luck. Deputy Commissioner Wallace received the package on the 3rd day. He read it that evening and sent word to Marsh that it would be entered into the commission session record. The entry was made. The protected status was formally noted. Theodora took the eastbound stage back to Caldwell the following morning feeling, for the first time in 3 months, something that resembled the possibility of relief. She arrived back in Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon in late January, to find the town in a state of muted tension that she could feel the moment she stepped off the stage. 3 men she did not recognize were standing outside the Crew Land and Cattle Company office, watching the street with the focused, proprietary attention of men who had been posted rather than men who had happened to congregate. Petty in the land office would not meet her eyes when she walked past the window. She went straight to Agnes Holly's, who took one look at her face and pulled her into the kitchen. "Crew knows you went to Wichita," Agnes said. "How?" "He has someone on the stage line. He doesn't know what you did there, but he knows you went, and he knows you went with your father's satchel, and he is sufficiently worried about what that might mean that he called in some outside help. The 3 men on the street are not from here. Where is Edwin?" Agnes looked at her for a fraction of a second with an expression that was very briefly and very specifically something other than simply worried. "His office. He came by this morning asking if I'd had word of you. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping." Theodora went to Edwin's office at a pace that was too fast for dignity and too steady for panic. She pushed open the door. He was at the drafting table, but he was not working. He was sitting very still with his hands flat on the blank paper and his head bowed, and when she came in he looked up with an expression that told her, with absolute clarity and with a force that went straight through her careful professional composure, that the 4 days she had been gone had mattered to him in a way that had nothing to do with land deeds. "Theodora," he said. "It's done," she said. "The protected status is in the commission session record. Wallace entered it the day before yesterday. It's formal." He stood up slowly, the way people stand when they are absorbing something that has been pressing against them from the inside. It held. It held. And then, because the relief was enormous, and because the months of shared work and shared risk had built a foundation of such honesty between them that pretending felt impossible, Theodora crossed the room and took his hands in both of hers, and for a moment they simply stood there, holding what they had built together and what was only now beginning to become safe. His hands were warm and steady and large around hers, and the lamplight was the same amber it always was at this time of day, and outside the prairie was gray and cold, and none of that mattered at all. "Crew knows I went to Wichita," she said, not moving back. "I know." Agnes sent word. His thumbs moved, a slight, deliberate pressure against the backs of her hands. He's going to push back hard. I know. The protected status changes the legal ground, but it doesn't eliminate the fight. His attorneys are going to challenge the hydrological data. They'll attack the methodology of the survey. They'll try to argue the Territorial Commission overstepped. They can try all of that, Theodora said. Your methodology is unimpeachable. Marcus Marsh used that exact word, and the Commission's jurisdiction is established by statute. They have no ground. No legal ground, he said quietly. I'm thinking about the other kind. She looked up at him. They were standing very close now, closer than they had stood before, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and the faint tension in his jaw that said he was holding something back. Say what you're thinking, she said. I'm thinking, he said carefully, that when Crew realizes the legal route is blocked, he may decide to approach this differently. And I'm thinking that you are staying in Agnes Hollies' hotel, and that Agnes is a formidable woman, but she is not in a position to hold off 3 imported men with uncertain intentions. And he looked at her for a long moment with that direct, gray, entirely unguarded gaze. And I am thinking that I would prefer you to be somewhere safer, and that the most logical place I can think of is somewhere that is legally documented as belonging to a person with standing in this matter, which creates a different set of complications for anyone who would interfere with the occupants. You're suggesting I stay on the Garrison parcel. I'm suggesting you stay on the Garrison parcel, he said, and that I survey the boundary markers formally as of this week, with witnesses, which establishes fresh legal presence and makes any interference with the property unambiguous trespass. He paused. I am also thinking that 2 people on that parcel are a great deal more defensible than 1. Theodora was quiet for a moment. You would stay on the parcel with me, if you would have me. The if you would have me landed differently from the way a practical arrangement ought to land. They were both aware of it. Neither of them looked away. I'll have you, she said. The move to the Garrison parcel happened the following morning, in the clear cold light of a January Friday. Edwin loaded his surveying equipment onto the back of his old bay mare, and Theodora carried her carpetbag and her father's satchel, and they walked out of Caldwell together along the South Fork Road, through the brittle winter grass and the pale sky, while Crew's 3 imported men watched from the street with expressions that communicated certain things about intention and were intended to intimidate. Theodora did not look at them. Edwin walked beside her at a pace that was unhurried and entirely deliberate. The Garrison house was a single-story structure of cottonwood timber and whitewashed plaster that her father had built in stages over 20 years, adding a room here and a window there as time and funds allowed. It was cold inside from having been empty for 3 months, but it was solid. The roof was tight. The iron stove in the main room drew cleanly. There was firewood stacked against the side wall, her father's habitual preparedness outlasting him. They spent the first day making the house functional and setting the boundary markers. Edwin worked with the focused precision that she had come to recognize as his particular kind of care for a thing he took seriously, taking measurements and driving stakes with a methodical steadiness that was, in its way, a form of argument. We are here. This is the line. This belongs to her. He set up his drafting materials at the kitchen table. Theodora cooked on the iron stove, and the warmth of it spread through the room, and the smell of the food, and the sound of Edwin's pencil moving across paper, were so ordinary and so specific that they created, despite everything pressing against them from outside, a quality of rightness that Theodora noticed and filed away in the quiet part of herself, where she kept the things that mattered too much to examine carelessly. They were not alone for long. The Weaver family sent their eldest son over the second day, with a written message offering cooperation and whatever assistance they could provide. Old Braun came himself the day after, walking through the cold on his thick legs, to stand in the kitchen and read the documentation Theodora spread on the table and say, in his German-accented English, that he had been waiting for someone to do this properly for 2 years. Mrs. Kellerman, the widow, arrived on the fourth day in her wagon with her 2 children, and a look of exhausted relief that said more than her careful, quiet words. She had received another visit from Crew's men the previous afternoon. They had been explicit this time. She had 3 days to take their offer, or the title defect they had found in her original filing would be activated. She had come to Theodora because she did not know where else to go. Theodora sat her down and made her coffee and looked at the original filing document that Mrs. Kellerman had brought and spent 45 minutes going through it and then looked up. "There is no title defect," she said. "This is clean. The defect they're claiming is based on a reference to a survey line that Crew's own people adjusted. The original line is correct. Mrs. Kellerman, they invented this." Mrs. Kellerman pressed both hands over her face for a moment. Then she took them down and looked at Theodora with red-rimmed eyes and a steady jaw. "What do we do?" "We add your parcel to the documentation package that's already with the Territorial Commission," Theodora said. "We file a formal notice of contested interference with the county recorder, which creates a public record. And we wait for Crew to make his next move, because the next move is going to tell us what he's actually prepared to do now that the legal route is narrowing." Edwin, who had been listening from the doorway, said quietly, "I'll prepare the supplementary survey notation for Mrs. Kellerman's boundary tonight." Mrs. Kellerman looked at him and then at Theodora and then at the space between them, which was a certain kind of space that perceptive women of all conditions tend to notice and correctly identify. She said nothing about it, but something in her expression softened. Crew's next move came 11 days later, and it was more direct than Theodora had anticipated and less direct than Edwin had feared. It came in the form of a formal legal challenge filed in the Comanche County District Court, contesting the Territorial Commission's jurisdiction over the South Fork Spring on the grounds that the spring had been part of a continuous cattle operation on the Crew land that predated the Commission's authority. The claim was, as Theodora identified within 20 minutes of reading it, almost entirely fabricated. There was no continuous cattle operation. The Crew Land and Cattle Company had only been established in the county 2 years ago. But it was filed properly and it would require response, and response required an attorney, and attorneys in Comanche County were thin on the ground when it came to opposing Aldous Crew. "Marsh," Edwin said. "Marsh is in Wichita. We need someone locally registered to appear in the district court." "There's an attorney in Medicine Lodge," Agnes Holly said from the doorway of the kitchen where they had gathered the next morning. "Name of Carver, James Carver. He came through here last fall. He has no connection to Crew that I know of, and he mentioned that he had handled a water rights case in Barber County 2 years back." Theodora wrote to Carver that morning. He wrote back in 6 days. He was willing. His fee was $40 for the initial filing and $20 per subsequent appearance. Theodora had $40 in the bottom of her father's satchel, which she had saved from her bookkeeping wages over 2 years against exactly the kind of unforeseen necessity that this was. She sent the money with the reply. Carver appeared in Caldwell the following week, a rangy, sun-darkened man of about 45 with a methodical approach to legal strategy that reminded Theodora pleasantly of Edwin's approach to survey work. He read through everything she and Edwin had compiled, asked precise and intelligent questions, and said that the Territorial Commission's jurisdiction was sound, and that Crew's challenge was going to have difficulty surviving a competent response. "Crew knows this too," Edwin said. He and Carver were sitting across the kitchen table from each other while Theodora stood at the stove. "He's not expecting this challenge to win. He's using it to delay and to force costs. Then we respond quickly, and we respond completely, and we deprive him of the delay," Carver said. "Miss Garrison, the documentation you have assembled is some of the best organized case material I have worked with in 20 years of practice. Your father raised a thorough woman." "He did," Theodora said, and felt the grief and the gratitude arrive together, as they often did when she thought of Robert Garrison. The response to Crew's challenge was filed in the district court at the end of February. Carver's response was precise and devastating in its methodical dismantling of Crew's claimed history, cross-referencing the county's own records to show that no cattle operation of the kind described had existed in the relevant time period, and attaching Edwin's complete hydrological survey as evidentiary exhibit. While the court waited on Crew's attorneys to respond, something began to shift in Caldwell. It shifted the way things shift when a story changes in a community, quietly at first and then with gathering speed. The story had been, for 2 years, that Aldous Crew was the future and the old homesteaders were an impediment to progress, and that resistance was futile and possibly foolish. The story was becoming something different. The story was becoming, with the care that Theodora and Edwin and the assembled homesteaders had put into it, the story of a documented, provable fraud that was being systematically exposed. People who had been watching from a distance began, cautiously, to move closer. A rancher from the north end of the county sent a letter to Carver with information about a separate incident of boundary tampering that matched the pattern. A merchant on Front Street stopped being carefully neutral and started being quietly helpful. Petty, the land office clerk, appeared one morning at the Garrison house looking as though he had not slept in several days, and told Theodora, in a voice that was barely a whisper, that he had kept his own copies of certain documents that had been presented to him for registration, because something in him had refused to destroy the originals despite having been told to, and that he was willing to provide those copies to Carver if Theodora could guarantee that his cooperation would be acknowledged in any subsequent proceedings. "I can't guarantee anything that isn't mine to guarantee," Theodora told him honestly. "But Mr. Carver can speak to the district court about the circumstances of your cooperation, and that is worth considerably more than anything I could promise." Petty nodded. He looked simultaneously terrified and relieved, the expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally put it down. Through all of this, the daily life on the Garrison parcel continued with its own texture and its own rhythm, and the distance between Theodora and Edwin, which had been contracting steadily since November, continued to contract in the way that things contract when people spend their days working on something difficult and important together, and their evenings in the same warm kitchen and their mornings at the same table over the same coffee, with the same view of the winter-gray South Fork draw through the window. They talked. They talked the way people talk when they have stopped performing for each other and are simply being themselves, which is the most intimate kind of conversation there is. Theodora told him about her mother, about what it had been like to lose her at 9 years old, and to have her father look at her across the breakfast table the next morning and simply say, with the helpless honesty of a man who did not know how to comfort a grief he was inside himself, "We are going to be all right, but it is going to be hard for a while," and how that sentence, terrible as it was in its acknowledgement of the difficulty, had been more useful to her than any false comfort would have been. Edwin told her about Missouri. He told her about the survey company he had worked for, and the specific moment when he had understood what was being asked of him, the morning a senior surveyor named Galloway had handed him a set of boundary notes with small numbers adjusted, so small that a casual reading would not catch them, and had explained with a kind of cheerful indifference that this was how the business worked, and that Edwin would be wise to understand the business. He told her about the cold certainty that had settled in him at that moment, that this was something he would not do, regardless of what it cost him. He told her about the threats that had followed his refusal. He told her about the long drive west, 1 man and 1 horse and 1 trunk of survey equipment, and the sustained, disciplined determination to build something clean in a new place. "You have been building something clean," she said. "Everything you've done here has been clean." He looked at her with the expression she had learned to identify as Edwin Warren's particular version of vulnerability, the careful, watching look of a man who was not accustomed to being seen clearly and was not entirely sure what to do with it when it happened. "So have you," he said. "From the first day." February moved toward March. The district court returned Cruz's challenge with a request for additional evidentiary support that Cruz's attorneys were unlikely to provide given that the evidence did not exist. Carver said privately that he expected the challenge to be dismissed within 30 days. Theodora stood at the kitchen window one evening in the first week of March and looked at the South Fork draw in the last light, the grass catching the sunset in the particular way it caught it when the season was about to turn, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled since November, since before November, since the telegram from Dodge City had arrived and the world had shifted. Edwin came to stand beside her. He did not speak for a moment. They stood side by side at the window in the quiet, looking at the same thing. "It's going to be all right," he said. "The way your father meant it, hard for a while, but all right." She turned her head and looked at his profile in the fading light. "Edwin." He turned to look at her. "I have been thinking about something," she said, and stopped. He waited. He was very good at waiting. "I have been thinking," she said, "that when this is resolved, when the deed is clear and the lien is lifted and the spring is protected, I am going to have to decide what I do with this land. Whether I stay or whether I go back to Dodge City or whether there is some other arrangement." "Yes," he said, "and I have been thinking that I would like to stay, that I want to stay, that this is home in a way that Dodge City was never home, and that the land is my father's covenant and I want to keep it." She looked at him steadily. "But that a woman alone on 160 acres in Comanche County, Kansas in 1885, is in a precarious position regardless of what the commission records say, and that I have been thinking about whether there is a less precarious arrangement available." He was very still. "I'm not asking you to do anything from obligation or convenience," she said carefully. "I want to be clear about that. I am asking because I want to ask, because the person I want beside me when I look at that draw in the evening is the person who is standing beside me right now." She took a slow breath. "Edwin Warren, would you consider staying on this land with me?" The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had preceded it. It was the silence of something opening rather than closing, the silence of a door swinging wide. He reached out and took her hand, the same way she had taken his hands in his office 6 weeks ago, both of hers around both of his, a complete and certain gesture. "Theodora Garrison," he said, in a voice that was low and entirely quiet and entirely sure, "I have considered little else for 3 months." She laughed. It came out with more force than she intended, and it was the best laugh she had laughed in longer than she could clearly remember, full of relief and warmth, and the genuine, uncalculated joy of someone discovering that what they hoped was true actually is. He smiled, the first full, unreserved smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his face the way light transforms a room, and she thought, with the clear and private certainty of someone who is done pretending otherwise, that she was entirely in love with this man. "There are practical considerations," she said when the laughter had settled. "We are not married. We are living on the same parcel, in a county that has opinions about such things. Those opinions can be addressed," he said. "They can," she agreed, "if you are asking what I think you're asking." "I'm asking," he said simply, "if you're saying yes to what I think you're saying." "I'm saying yes," she said. "To that specific question." He lifted her hand and held it against his chest, over his heart, in a gesture of such uncalculated tenderness that it went through her like the first warm day after a long winter, and she stepped closer, and he put his other arm around her shoulders and held her, and outside the window the South Fork draw went from gold to gray in the last of the March light. They were practical about it in the way that people who have spent months navigating complex situations together tend to be practical about everything. The next morning they went into Caldwell together, and Edwin spoke to Reverend Aldridge at the Methodist Church on the north end of Front Street, and they arranged for a ceremony 3 weeks hence, which was, as Agnes Holly said when they told her, Entirely too long, but also entirely appropriate given that Theodora was the kind of woman who would not have respected anything that felt rushed. The 3 weeks were busy. Carver filed the final response to Crew's challenge. The district court scheduled a hearing for the second week of March. The Territorial Commission sent a formal notice to the county land office acknowledging the protected status of the South Fork Spring under the 1875 Water Rights Statute, a notice that the county recorder was obliged by territorial law to enter into the official record. Aldous Crew did not appear at the district court hearing. His attorneys appeared, argued without conviction, and received from Judge Farrell a ruling that dismissed the challenge and upheld the commission's determination. The fraudulent lien on the Garrison deed was formally vacated 3 days later, after Carver presented Petty's documents and a renewed examination of the signature on the debt instrument, conducted by a handwriting expert from Wichita that Carver had arranged. When the ruling came down, Theodora was in the land office with Carver, and Petty, who had testified with evident relief and considerable courage about the circumstances in which the lien had been registered, handed her the amended deed with a new notation that read clear of encumbrance in Petty's neat clerk's hand. She looked at the deed for a long moment. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her father's satchel. "Your father would have taken considerable satisfaction in this," Carver said. "He would have said he told me so," Theodora said. "And then he would have made coffee." She went home to the Garrison parcel and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the deed. And then, with the kind of impulse that comes from a fullness of feeling rather than a plan, she found Edwin's pen and the bottle of ink on the corner of the table, and she turned the deed over and wrote on the blank back of it. She wrote briefly and honestly, and then she put the pen down and read what she had written, and folded the deed, and tucked it into the satchel and started on supper. She did not give Edwin the deed that evening. She was thinking about something else. She was thinking about a different letter, one that had arrived the previous week from a cousin of her mother's in Ohio, asking whether Theodora intended to stay in Kansas or return east, written with the particular combination of concern and invitation that said, between its lines, that a respectable berth was available if Theodora wanted to take it. She had not answered it. She had been waiting until she knew what there was to say. Now she knew. Edwin came in from the survey work he had been doing on the Weaver parcel boundary, which Carver had added to the formal documentation, and stood at the wash basin scrubbing the cold off his hands, and she handed him the coffee, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table in the comfortable, specific, entirely earned ease of people who have moved past performance and into the real thing. "I need to write a letter tonight," she said, "to my mother's cousin in Ohio. What will you tell her?" "That I'm staying, that I'm getting married in 10 days, that the land is clear." She looked at him. "That my father's covenant is intact." He looked back at her with that expression she had catalogued and loved, the one that was serious and warm and entirely present. "That is a good letter," he said. "It is." She paused. "I've been working on another one. I've been composing it in my head for about 3 weeks. She stood and went to the satchel and took out the deed and set it on the table between them, folded, the blank back showing. "I was going to write it on a separate paper, but then I thought it should be on this. It should be here on this because this is what everything has been about, this piece of paper, your work and my father's work and what we built together. So it should be here." She pushed the deed toward him. He picked it up and unfolded it, and she watched him read the legal language on the front, the text of the deed itself with its formal notation of clear title, and then turn it over. On the back, in Theodora's clear, careful hand, was a letter. Not a long letter, not a complicated letter. The kind of letter that says exactly what it means in as few words as it takes to say it with the completeness it deserves. It said, "Edwin, I have been trying to decide how to tell you something that I think you already know and that I want to say plainly anyway, because you are a man who values plainness, and because I am a woman who believes that the important things should be said out loud. I love you." Not for the survey or the spring or the deed or any of the practical architecture of what we have built together, though I am grateful for every piece of it. I love you for the way you held your integrity when it was costly, and for the way you waited, and for the specific, exact, irreplaceable way you see me. I would like to spend my life on this land beside you. I said yes to the land. I am saying yes to you. Your Theodora. Edwin read it. He read it again. He set the deed down on the table, and when he looked up his eyes were bright in the lamplight with something that was not quite suppressed, and his expression was the completely unguarded version of itself, the version she had only seen in glimpses until now, full and clear and unprotected. "Theodora," he said, in a voice that was not entirely steady. "Yes," she said. "I know, but I wanted it written down." He stood up from the table and came around to her side of it, and took her face in both his hands and kissed her. The first time. With the full force of everything that had been building since November in the cold and the lamplight, and the shared, difficult, necessary work of building something worth keeping. And she kissed him back with equal force and equal honesty, because she was done being careful about this particular thing. They were married on the 14th of March, 1885, on a Tuesday when the first hint of spring was in the air over the Kansas grass, and the South Fork was running clear, and the cottonwood trees along its bank were beginning to show the first pale green of new leaves. Reverend Aldridge performed the ceremony in the Methodist church, small and plain and perfectly sufficient. Agnes Hollies was there, and the Weaver family, and old Braun and Mrs. Kellerman and her 2 children, and Carver, who had stayed in town to see the conclusion of the matter he had come to care about, and Petty, who came in the back and sat quietly and whose presence Theodora acknowledged with a specific nod that made him sit a little straighter. Edwin had no family in Comanche County, but he had these people, and they were enough, because they were real and they were present, and they had all of them, in one way or another, been part of what had been built here and survived. Theodora wore her best dress, which was the dark blue wool she had brought from Dodge City and had pressed carefully the night before, and she carried a small bundle of dried prairie grass tied with a strip of ribbon, because it was March in Kansas, and there were no flowers yet, but the grass was what the land was made of, and it seemed right. Edwin wore his good coat and a clean white shirt, and looked at her when she walked into the church with an expression that Agnes Hollies later described, with characteristic economy, as the way a man looks when he understands that he is exactly where he is supposed to be. After the ceremony they walked back to the Garrison parcel in the March light, the whole small company of them, and Agnes had arranged for food to be brought, and there was coffee and pie, and the particular warmth of people who have been through something hard together and have come out the other side into something good. Old Braun made a toast in German that no one entirely understood, but everyone felt the meaning of. The Weaver children ran in the new grass. Mrs. Kellerman's children ran after them. Aldous Crew left Comanche County 2 weeks later, reportedly relocating his operations to the Oklahoma Territory, where, as far as anyone in Caldwell knew, he had not changed his fundamental character, but had at least changed his location. His absence was felt as a kind of atmospheric change, the way the pressure drops before a storm and then rises cleanly afterward, the air lighter and cleaner and easier to breathe. Petty, in the wake of the court proceedings, was kept on at the land office under a new county recorder, who had been elected in a special proceeding that several of the South Fork homesteaders had actively organized. He turned out, under different supervisory conditions, to be a genuinely competent clerk. He never again falsified anything. The Warren parcel, as it was now registered in the county records, because Theodora Garrison Warren had insisted that the deed reflect both names, and Carver had quietly confirmed that the territorial statutes of 1885 permitted joint registration of a married couple, was worked through the spring of that year, with the focused energy of 2 people who understood that the land required everything you had to give it, and who found in the giving a kind of satisfaction that could not be manufactured in any other way. Edwin expanded his survey practice to serve the full county, taking on clients among the remaining homesteaders and the newer settlers who were beginning to arrive as the opening of the Oklahoma Territory drew population through Kansas, and as the coming of the railroad had made the region more accessible. His reputation for accuracy and integrity, which had been confined to those who knew him well, became more broadly known in the way that reputations become known when the circumstances that test them become public record. He worked hard and he worked honestly, and he came home in the evenings to the Garrison house, which was becoming the Warren house in the incremental, organic way of places that absorbed the people in them. And Theodora cooked and kept the books and worked the land and was as comprehensively, stubbornly, productively herself as she had always been, which was exactly what he had expected and exactly what he wanted. In the summer of 1885, they added a second room to the house, expanding the original footprint in a direction that captured the morning light. They did the work themselves over the course of 3 weeks in July, with help from the Weaver boys on the days when the framing needed more than 2 pairs of hands. The new room had a window that looked east over the draw, and in the mornings, when the light came through it and lay in a broad stripe across the wooden floor, it was the most beautiful thing Theodora had seen in any interior she had occupied. Edwin made a small table for that window, with the same precise care he gave to everything he made, and Theodora put her father's old ledger and a new one she had started herself on that table. And sometimes in the evenings she sat there and wrote, not accounts but the other kind of writing that she had always done privately and had never shown to anyone, the kind that was about what things meant rather than what they were. She showed some of it to Edwin one evening in September, when the heat had broken and the evening air had the first sharp note of autumn in it, and they were sitting together in the lamplight in the comfortable silence that was their particular kind of intimacy. He read it carefully, in the way he read everything, with full attention and without rushing. "You should keep doing this," he said when he looked up. "It's only for me," she said. "The best things usually start that way," he said. In October of 1885, exactly 1 year after the telegram had arrived in Dodge City and set the whole of it in motion, Theodora told Edwin that they were going to have a child. She told him in the evening, at the east window table, with the first hard frost of autumn whitening the grass outside and the lamp burning its steady amber, and he received the news with the same quality of open, unguarded feeling he brought to everything that mattered to him, sitting very still for a moment, and then taking her hands and saying nothing at all for a long moment that said everything. The child was born the following June, a boy, in the warmth of the expanded house with Agnes Hollies present as midwife, and the South Fork running its highest of the year outside the window. They named him Robert, after Theodora's father, because the covenant deserved continuance, and the name deserved carrying forward by someone who would grow up on the land it was attached to and understand, in his bones, what it had taken to hold it. Agnes, holding him for the first time while Edwin stood beside Theodora's bed with her hand in his, and the expression of a man who has been shown something he did not know was possible, said, Robert Garrison would have approved very highly of all of this. He would have said it was about time, Theodora said, and Edwin laughed, which was the best sound in the room after the baby's own voice, and Theodora laughed with him because the joy of it was too much to contain inside one person and had to be shared to be fully itself. Robert Warren grew into a child of the South Fork draw, a boy who followed his father across survey lines and sat on his mother's lap while she worked at the east window table, and who, by the age of 2, could identify the different grasses of the Kansas prairie with a confidence that made old Braun, when he came to visit, shake his head and say something approving in German that nobody translated but everyone understood. By 1887, the Warren parcel was one of the most productive operations on the South Fork, not large by the standards of the cattle barons who were beginning to consolidate land in the region, but entirely itself, held with the kind of intentional, informed care that comes from people who understand what they have and why it matters. The spring still ran. The grass still bent in the wind. The survey markers that Edwin had driven into the cold ground on that January morning 2 years back still stood in their exact and deliberate positions at every corner of the property, monuments to accuracy and to the particular kind of love that expresses itself through precision. Theodora wrote to Marcus Marsh in Wichita the spring of 1887 to thank him for his role in the original proceedings, a letter she had been composing mentally for 2 years and had kept postponing in the press of daily life. Marsh wrote back promptly and with genuine warmth, and his reply contained a piece of information that made her sit very still at the east window table for several minutes. He had heard from a colleague that a young woman in Barber County, facing a situation with alarming similarities to the Garrison case, was looking for guidance on water rights documentation. Would Theodora be willing to correspond? She wrote back yes within the hour. The correspondence that followed was the beginning of something she had not planned but recognized immediately as necessary, a practical exchange of legal information and documentation strategies between women who were fighting for their land in a legal landscape that had not been designed with them in mind, using the tools that were available to them with the thoroughness and precision that their circumstances demanded. It was not a movement, not formally, not then. It was a series of letters. But letters had a way of becoming things, she had learned. She had learned this from the letter on the back of a deed. The Kellerman widow remarried in the spring of 1887 to a farmer from Barber County, a solid and apparently genuinely kind man named Hopper who had come through Caldwell on business and had met Margaret Kellerman at Agnes Hollies's table and had conducted a courtship of such transparent sincerity that even Agnes, who was not easily impressed, said he seemed like the real thing. Margaret's land joined the Hopper operation. The children gained a father who treated them well. This was, Theodora thought, about as much as you could ask for. Old Braun died peacefully in the winter of 1887, in his own bed, in his own house, on his own land, which passed to his nephew who came from Germany to work it, and who continued the old man's habit of walking his boundary lines every Sunday morning, with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who understands that land held by honest labor is a form of argument against everything that would dispossess you. The Weaver family prospered. Their eldest son, who had been 12 when the winter of the legal fight had begun, grew into a young man of considerable capability, who helped Edwin with survey work in the summers, and who turned out, at 17, to have an aptitude for legal documentation that Theodora encouraged by lending him her father's old law manuals and corresponding with Marsh about whether there was a way to get the boy into a proper legal education. A project that Marsh eventually helped accomplish by connecting them with a Wichita law office that took apprentices. Agnes Hollies remained at the Drover's Rest, formidable and essential and entirely herself, the axis around which Caldwell's practical life continued to turn. She was the first person Theodora told about the second pregnancy, in the autumn of 1888, and Agnes received the news with a brisk nod and the immediate practical assessment that the house would need the addition of a third room if they were going to keep adding Warrens to it. They added the room. Edwin did most of the work himself through the October and November, in the evenings after the survey work was done, building it with the same quiet precision and care that characterized everything he made. The room was finished by December, in time for the winter, and it faced south, and on clear days you could see a long way across the grass from its window. The second child was born in March of 1889, another boy. They named him James after Carver, who had come through Caldwell the previous summer and had visited the parcel and had stood at the east window and looked at the South Fork draw with the expression of a man who is satisfied with something he helped to create and who does not need anyone to say so out loud. When Theodora's letter arrived in Medicine Lodge with the news and the name, Carver wrote back one sentence: "I am honored beyond what I can adequately express," which was, for a man of his disposition, a considerable statement. James Warren was a different child from his brother, louder and quicker and more immediately social, with his mother's green eyes and his father's considering expression, and a laugh that could be heard from the south end of the parcel when he was happy, which was most of the time. He and Robert grew up together in the way of brothers who are close enough in age to be genuine companions, different enough in temperament to be interesting to each other, and similar enough in their fundamental formation to recognize each other as kin in the deepest sense. Edwin told Theodora, one evening in the spring of 1889, when Robert was 3 and James was a month old, and they were sitting together at the east window, watching the last light over the draw, while the baby slept in the wooden cradle that Edwin had made during the winter, that he could not entirely account for the distance between where he had been when he first drove into Comanche County 4 years ago and where he was now. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean that when I came here I was carrying the specific weight of a man who has done the right thing at some cost, and is not sure the cost was worth it," he said. "I mean that I was 30 years old and I had a good profession and good work habits, and no particular sense that the work was connected to anything larger than the work itself." He was quiet for a moment. "I mean that I do not think I understood what a life could look like until I watched you walk into my office and start asking questions." She looked at him in the evening light, this man who was her husband and her partner and her home in the most real and specific sense of that word. And now, he said, "I understand that the measuring of a thing is only the beginning of knowing it. You have to live on it, you have to keep it." She reached across the space between them and took his hand, and they sat together while the light went from gold to gray over the Kansas grass, and the baby made a small sound in his cradle, and Robert's voice came from somewhere behind the house, calling to one of the Weaver boys in the high, clear voice of a child who is unself-conscious in his own belonging. And the South Fork ran as it had always run, constant and sure. Under the ground and through the ground and up into the light where everyone who cared to look could see it. This was what had been protected. This was what the deed had meant, and the letter, and the yes she had said to each. Not a legal abstraction. Not a parcel number in a county record. This, the light on the grass and the sound of children and the hand of a person you trust, and the knowledge, built from years of shared work and shared difficulty and shared joy, that what you have is real and that you helped to make it and that it is going to last. In the summer of 1890, 5 years after the legal battle that had begun on a November afternoon with a telegram and a forged signature, the Comanche County District Court issued a formal judgment in a companion case that Carver had built using the precedent of the Warren water rights documentation, protecting the water claims of 11 additional homesteading families along the South Fork and its tributaries. The judgment was reported in the Caldwell commercial newspaper with a headline that mentioned the original Warren case and described it as the foundation of the county's most significant water rights precedent. The reporter, a young woman new to the paper, had done her research carefully and had the facts right. Agnes Hollies brought the newspaper to the Garrison house, which everyone still called the Garrison house even though the deed said Warren, because some names outlast their occasion and become part of the landscape, and set it on the kitchen table and said nothing, because the newspaper said what needed saying. Theodora read the article. Then she looked up at Edwin, who was reading over her shoulder, and then at Agnes, who was wearing her characteristic expression of practical satisfaction with a small but genuine warmth underneath it. "Your father," Agnes said. "Yes," Theodora said. She went to the east window table and took out the old deed, which she kept there in the leather satchel alongside her ledgers, and looked at it. Both sides. The clean notation on the front, clear of encumbrance. The letter on the back in her own hand, worn now at the folds from having been unfolded and refolded over 5 years, but legible still, every word of it. She had said yes to each, that night in the lamplight. She had meant it with the fullness of a person who has thought it all the way through and found it true. It was true. It remained true. It would remain true for all the years that followed, for the third child that came in 1892, a girl they named Alina, who had her grandfather's stubborn jaw and her father's gray eyes, and who grew up with the land in her bones and the story of the deed in her memory, and who, when she was old enough to understand it, asked her mother to tell it to her again and again, not because she had forgotten, but because some stories need to be told repeatedly to fully receive them. It would remain true for the long evenings at the east window table and the survey work and the letters and the ledgers and the gradual, steady building of a life that was entirely itself, built from what they had brought to it and what the land had given back, honest and hard-earned and luminous with the specific kind of meaning that only comes from things you fought for and chose. Edwin Warren lived his whole long life on that parcel. He surveyed half the county and mentored 3 of the next generation surveyors, and built 2 additional rooms onto the house, and made furniture of quiet, precise beauty that lasted decades. He never lost the quality of careful, present attention that had been the first thing Theodora had noticed about him, the way he listened with his whole self, and did not speak until he had something worth saying. He said many things worth saying over many years, in the way of a man who has found his place and knows it, and is not shy about the knowing. Theodora Garrison, Warren kept the land and the ledgers, and the correspondence with women fighting for their own land claims, and the east window table and the old leather satchel. She kept the deed. She kept everything that mattered with the methodical, loving tenacity of a woman who understands that keeping is its own form of faith, its own form of love, its own form of argument against everything that would erase you. The South Fork Spring ran on, clean and constant, under the Comanche County grass. The boundary markers stood. The survey records held. The deed bore both their names. On the blank back of it, in careful ink, the letter she had written. He had written his letter to her on the back of that deed too, not on the deed she held, but in the other sense, in the surveyor's notes and the hydrological records and the 18 months of cold mornings measuring the water table, which was itself a letter of extraordinary length and specificity saying, "This land is worth defending, and you are worth defending it with, and I have been building the argument since before you arrived." She had read both sides. She had said yes to each. That was the whole of it. That was the covenant kept and the land held, and the love made real in the specific, daily, irreplaceable way that love becomes real when it is built from work and honesty, and the willingness to see clearly and to say plainly and to stay. Outside the east window the Kansas grass bent in the evening wind the way it had always bent, and the light went across it the way light always goes across it, and the South Fork ran, and the land endured, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.